Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with a chat on why Mozart's musical joke is funny. Now, I'm not the only person, I'm sure, who came to Mozart's musical joke, listening to it, thinking, ha, it's a joke, it's going to be hysterical. And then I play it and I listen to it, and it's like, okay, it's got some wrong notes, it's got some obvious things, but it's kind of nice, it's pretty, it has good tunes, it's pleasant. What's so funny about it? It's a problem, because there are a couple of issues here. The first issue is this. Is if you have to explain a joke, it isn't funny. I mean, basically, right? Either you get it or you don't get it. That's number one. Number two is there's a world of difference between a piece of music that is a miracle of high culture that contains a joke, as much music by Haydn and Mozart and even Beethoven. I mean, they do contain humorous bits and jokes, laugh out loud jokes sometimes, and a piece of music which is itself a joke, where the humor is a result of questions of compositional competence and a general deliberate undermining of expectations of correct form or correct style, especially for modern listeners today, because we don't know what the rules of composition were in Mozart's day. I mean, most of us listeners, of course, musicologists and music students and people like that, yes, they learn the rules, which Mozart is hell-bent on violating through most of this piece. But once having violated them, we don't necessarily hear it in the sense of hearing it as a violation. And if we do hear it, do we find it funny? I'm not exactly sure. As a result, it's taken me a long time, a very long time, to decide that I was ready to do this talk, because I'm going to have to do a lot of explaining, and I'm afraid that explaining is going to suck all the fun out of the piece. Maybe it's just better to leave it and say, okay, either you get it or you don't get it, and then just leave it at that. But my dear friend, Dr. Sören Meyer-Eller in München, and I were chatting, and he said, you really ought to explain Mozart's musical joke. And I said, you really think so? And he said, yeah, what the hell? Give it a shot, see what happens. I said, well, okay, I'm going to give it a try. So if I blow this and it's a complete failure, his name is Dr. Sören Meyer-Eller, and you can blame him, because I'm doing my best. Now, the performance we're going to take is a splendid performance. That's the other trouble with the musical joke. You can play it so well that it's not even funny. Or you can play it and try to be funny and just make it sound stupid. I mean, humor in music is just so problematic. But we are lucky. We have Sándor Vég at our disposal in this 10 CD set of all of, except one, of the Mozart divertimentos and cassations and serenades and light music. And this is just one of the greatest sets of records ever made by anybody. It's on the Capriccio label. Here it is. There. I did my separate talk just about this set, and every sane person who cares about great music making or cares about Mozart has to have this box. And you'll tell, I'll be able to tell just from the samples I'm going to play you of this and one other piece. This is with the Camerata Academica des Mozarteums Salzburg. In other words, Mozart's hometown orchestra, which of course didn't exist until well after Mozart. In fact, it only exists because of Mozart. The Mozarteum of Salzburg obviously postdates Mozart himself. Anyway, let's get to it. What is the musical joke? All right. The musical joke is a serenade, a lighthearted piece of music in 4 movements, 2 quickies. The second movement is a minuet. The third movement is an andante, a slow movement. It can be performed by a full string orchestra with 2 horns, or by simply a string quintet with 2 horns. It's very similar in that sense to Eine kleine Nacht music, which will be our exemplar in making some apt comparisons. Now, obviously, musical humor first of all, the simplest kind of musical humor is, raspberries. In other words, wrong notes, things that don't belong, horrible sounding harmony. And Mozart does that. He does it, and it's very amusing when it happens, and it's just splendid. And here are two examples. The first comes from the minuet, where the horns just make a complete mess of things after a very pompous and dignified introduction. And the second, which follows immediately after just a 1-second pause, I put them together for ease of listening, is the very end of the whole work, the end of the finale, where basically just all hell breaks loose. And the end is very similar to the end of Charles Ives' Second Symphony, in which case the last chord is just, well, you'll hear for yourself. So here are these two obviously humorous examples of horrendous wrong note harmony that will tickle your musical funny bones. Here we go. Now, this entire work, I mean, you got that, right? I don't have to talk about it anymore. This entire work is only about 15 minutes long, maybe a little bit less. And it's amazing how much stuff Mozart packs into this 15 minutes. So in addition to horn players who don't know what they're doing, we also have a completely psychotic violin soloist. Now, this violin soloist thinks that he or she is the most fabulous, passionate, sensitive soloist that ever lived. And this soloist is not only stupid, but has absolutely no taste whatsoever. The soloist is just a mess. And we first encounter this dreadful soloist in the middle section, the trio section of the minuet, which is given to the solo violin. And we hear two things that this violinist wants to do, neither of which it does particularly well. One of which is play scales and runs, which don't amount to anything thematically. And the other is a sort of cutesy-poo, coy noodling with scraps of melody exchanged with the rest of the ensemble. So I'm going to play the trio, the whole trio, just so you get a sense, without repeats, just so you get a sense of what this soloist is about. Because one of the things that's rather cool about this piece is that, Mozart was a symphonist, and Mozart, like most symphonists, was able to bind works together symphonically, and even this one gets a little bit of unity that's produced by the fact that the two inner movements both feature this extraordinarily demented violinist who has a genuine musical personality. It's a completely repellent personality, but it's a personality. So here is the trio of the minuet. Note the unimaginative phrasing. Everything ends with dum bum. Pause. What do I do next? So that's the trio of the minuet. The next time we encounter the soloist even more extensively and in a more fully fledged development of his or her odious personality is in the third movement, the slow movement. It opens in a way which is absolutely beyond description. You can't really tell what key it's in. I mean, the violin is so busy being sentimental, it doesn't know where it's supposed to start. And so the orchestra has to kind of figure out before it settles into an actual tonality that we might recognize. And then there's much more of that cutesy stuff going on. Remember, for example, that cartoon where Bugs Bunny dresses in drag. It's like a woman and tries to seduce Elmer Fudd. Well, that's what happens in this slow movement. That's basically what it's about. I mean, the equivalent of that. If you think of the solo violin as Bugs Bunny in drag, then I think you're going to, and just imagine a sort of plot line as the violin interacts with the rest of the orchestra. I think you'll get it quite well. You'll get the joke. But this movement culminates after a grand introduction in a cadenza. Now, for those of you who are not, musically into these vocabulary items, a cadenza is an improvised solo. Used to be, not always. Now they get written down most of the time because you'll hear why. Because composers do not trust soloists to improvise things with any taste and sensible timing and clarity of thought. And this is why Beethoven in his Emperor Concerto famously wrote a note saying, "Do not make a cadenza, rather proceed with the following," and then wrote it down, forbidding forevermore soloists from making their own cadenzas. Although there were a couple of exceptions. For example, Brahms' Violin Concerto, where he had his friend, the amazing violin virtuoso Joseph Joachim, and he left the cadenza for Joachim to do because he knew that Joachim wasn't going to screw it up. But it must have been quite something in Mozart's day, because there were many soloists who thought themselves flashy virtuosi, and they did indeed screw it up. And this soloist particularly screws it up. So here is a cadenza. A cadenza, theoretically, it's supposed to be, just so you know what its musical function is, it's supposed to bridge the gap between the end of the actual sort of musical discussion and the final chords of the movement. It's an opportunity for, a cadence is a closing formula in music. A sequence of chords that brings a piece to a conclusion, that it leads you to the ending. And so a cadenza is supposed to accomplish that. This particular soloist has no idea what it's doing or where it wants to go or how to get there, and it finally simply gives up with a pizzicato plonk. So here is the cadenza from the slow movement of a musical joke. Here you go. Well, the joke, obviously, is that we have absolutely no idea what's going to happen or why. And, however lovely it may sound, and it always does. Mozart's philosophy aesthetically, you remember, was enunciated in his discussion of the composition of his opera, The Abduction from the Seraglio, where he said that no matter how horrible or gruesome the situation, the music must never offend the ear. So no matter how grotesque the jokes get in a musical joke, the music will not offend the ear. It will tickle the ear. It will titillate your funny bone, but it will not be obnoxiously offensive, even though this soloist comes as pretty close to being obnoxiously offensive as a soloist can get. So those are the two inner movements, and they're quite simple, but I don't want to play complete movements in this little chat because I want you to have to put it all together. My hope is that if I sort of give you hints and tastes of it, then when you hear the whole thing, the jokes will become even funnier, and you'll get them. You'll get them without having to have every single thing explained, because that would just be horribly dull and I think kind of pointless. So the outer movements are formally more sophisticated than the inner movements, because the minuet is just an ABA, and the slow movement is it's an attempt at a song. So the first movement is in, allegedly, sonata form. Now, sonata form is easy to grasp. Essentially, you have two key areas, and then a development section and a repeat of the two key areas in the home key entirely. So it's one key area and the ending. That's what it is. It's all about leaving a key and returning to that key at the end. That's all sonata form does. But of course, in the hands of genius composers such as Haydn and Mozart and Beethoven, it became one of the greatest things in the history of music, and it still is, because it's still used by any number of composers, because it's just so bloody effective. So Mozart here is dealing with making the form funny. And making forms funny is a little bit sophisticated. It's something that you'll have to get used to, and it depends on your own feeling for what form is supposed to do and what it's supposed to be. There is the obvious part of this, which I'll tell you about in a second, and then there is, the more you know your sonata form and the more you've listened to Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven, the funnier this is going to get, because the more you'll realize just how demented Mozart's take on it is. So let's start at the very beginning. I have a comparison here, which I think will be quite helpful. What I want to do is, I'm going to play you the exposition, the entire exposition, that is the thematic material of the first movement of a musical joke, so that you can hear what Mozart's doing, and we'll talk about it after you've heard it. So let's give it a listen, and then we'll have a little chat. What is the first thing you notice about that? Well, the first thing I noticed about it is that it has no thematic distinction whatsoever. Everything, it's fragmented, and its phrases are short, and everything ends with thwump, 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 da-da-da-da-da, bump, thwump, 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 right? It doesn't go anywhere. Now, the first principle of a sonata form movement is that it goes. It has to go somewhere. And this particular one, it just lays there, because the composer does not know how to write a tune, or how to end a phrase, or how to create a phrase that moves to the next phrase. He keeps ending with the same three notes, womp, womp, womp. Even when he has a different tune, it ends with the same three notes. It's stuck. So it is a absolute musical example of being stuck in a rut. And it's marvelous. But the interesting thing about the fact that it's stuck in a rut, is that this exposition is almost identical in shape, not in melody, not in material, but in shape, to the exposition of Eine kleine Nachtmusik, that famous Eine kleine Nachtmusik. It begins with a loud fanfare-like gesture, both pieces, followed by a more feminine, gracious, soft answer, and then the music sort of takes off, and you get to a alleged second subject in a complementary key. The difference is that this particular piece, the musical joke, the second subject basically doesn't exist. I mean, it has no tune. It's just an empty pattern of notes, whereas in Eine kleine Nachtmusik, even though it's very, very short, it has two beautiful, luscious, generous, charming, unforgettable melodies. In other words, the difference is one of compositional skill. The guy who wrote Eine kleine Nachtmusik knew how to write melodies. The guy who wrote a musical joke did not. Well, he did, but he was pretending that he did not. And so I'm going to play you now the exposition of Eine kleine Nachtmusik, indicating each section of the exposition. That is, first theme, the motion music that takes us to the second theme, the second subject, so you can see how it develops. And then I'm going to replay you what we just heard, the exposition of a musical joke, with the same tags, so that you can see what the equivalent is. And I think once you hear the two things in comparison to each other, you'll hear why a musical joke is funny. You have to compare like to like. It's not just a question of me explaining it. It's so much better to hear something that does the same thing correctly, and then you'll get the joke. So here is Eine kleine Nachtmusik, the exposition, and take a look at the superscription so you see what's happening. And here, once again, is the exposition of a musical joke, with now labeled correctly so that you can hear exactly how it corresponds to what you just heard in Eine kleine Nachtmusik. So let's continue this. I mean, I think this is interesting. This this A-B comparison business that we're doing. Let's move on to the development section. Now, what is a development section in a sonata movement supposed to do? Well, it's supposed to take you through several keys, or, distant keys or relationship keys. It's supposed to work with the musical material that we've heard so far, some of it or all of it or just a bit of it in the exposition, and lead us back home. It will eventually take us back home. And so Eine kleine Nachtmusik, as you heard, has a delicious little tune in the second half of its second subject. Da 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 dum, bum 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 ba da dum, ba da 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 dum. That's the little tune. That is the entire subject of the development section. But what Mozart does with it, in this teeny tiny little, it's like 30 seconds of music or less, is remarkable. He wrings so much character and expression from this charming little tune. It becomes anxious, it becomes nervous, a little bit pathetic, a little bit humorous. It's just fantastic, the amount of mileage expressively that Mozart gets out of that tiny little tune. And so let's listen to Eine kleine Nachtmusik, the development section and the beginning of the recapitulation, so you can hear how it leads back to the beginning of the movement. Now, if the development section of Eine kleine Nachtmusik is a miracle of concise, expressive intensity, then the development section of a musical joke is a catastrophe. It doesn't develop anything. Why? Because we've already heard. What is it going to develop? The second subject had no theme. The second theme, theoretically, it was a non-theme. It was just a pattern of stuff. And the first subject just turned around in on itself. It was as primitive and uninspiring as a piece of music could possibly be. And so the development section is going to get completely bogged down trying to do something and succeeding in doing absolutely nothing. So with what you just heard from Eine kleine Nachtmusik in mind, let's listen to the development section of a musical joke. Now, you may have noticed I let it run over even more into the recapitulation. Why? Because in the recapitulation, Mozart foreshortens the sequence of events. Everything happens more quickly. He doesn't repeat things. He cuts out a repeat here. He leads some phrases to make them shorter. The result is that in the exposition, the sequence of happenings comes in much quicker and thus sounds even stupider, because there's even less. The irony is that even though it's shorter, there's even less continuity between sections because there's less balance between phrases. And I hope you noticed that. I just let it run. And again, if you don't get all of this just from hearing me talk or from hearing these little scraps, you have to play the whole piece. You have to listen to it whole. But I'm giving you some suggestions about where you might focus your attention, because when you hear it whole, that's when the true humor of the whole thing becomes manifest. Now, let's look at the finale. The finale is really is where the hysteria becomes, I think, most extreme. It's really, really twisted. Now, most finales are going to either be in sonata form or rondo form. Now, a rondo is what it sounds. It's a round. In other words, it's a round in which you have a tune, then you have an episode, then the tune comes back, then you have an episode, then the tune comes back. The tune is called the ritornello because it always returns, and that's what a rondo is. Most classical rondos have the form A B A C A. Now, what this finale is, I have no idea. It's not really in sonata form, and it's not really a rondo. It seems like it wants to be, but the composer gets so lost that it never really has much of any form at all. What happens is that it starts out with a tune, it's a tune every bit as pathetic as the one that opened the first movement, and that tune also goes nowhere. But oh, how hard the composer tries. First, he starts an episode, and that episode is a fugue. It starts out like a fugue. Now, you know what a fugue is? Like, Bach's fugues or the little fugue in G minor. It's a contrapuntal form where you have several voices that enter one after the other with the same thing, and then they may have a little episode, then they do it again, and then they may do it with the theme upside down. But the whole point is that you have a certain number of voices following each other with entries of the same tune. Well, this particular fugue also goes nowhere. That's the whole point. Mozart starts the fugue. It has actually, I think, 5 parts. Something like, 4 or 5 parts. And as soon as the last part comes in, he gives up. Totally gives up. And then he tries something else. He tries a different kind of episode, which also just peters out. And so finally, having attempted what seems to be the episodes in a kind of rondo form, he basically just says the hell with it and recapitulates everything from the beginning on the way to that ending that we already heard. So the finale is a completely busted form. That's what it is, really. It's just a wreck. It's a mess, formally speaking. And again, you have to know the whole movement, but if you do, once you know it well, it will become funnier every time you hear it, because you begin to realize just how pitiful the whole thing really is. And so, I'm going to play you now the opening of the finale, just that I don't know what you call it, the first half, because after the excerpt I'm playing you, it just starts over again, and then somehow manages to haul its carcass over the finish line. So here is the finale first half. And all you need to know, and what makes it so funny, is the fact that it goes absolutely nowhere. And no matter how hard it tries, and it does try, that's the fun part. Take a listen. All right. Was it funny? Did you get the jokes? I don't know. I don't know how successful this explanation has been. I hope what I've given you is the tools that you need to listen to the whole work from beginning to end, and your own free time with your ears totally open to its wackiness, and to let the music speak to you. And I think if you do that, you will indeed come to think of this as a joke every bit as humorous as Mozart intended that it be. So keep on listening, folks. Thank you for joining me. Whew, I'm glad that one's over. I really am. I hope I haven't spoiled this thing for like future generations of listeners. Take care.